If you'd like to earn CPE credit for listening to this episode, visit earmarkcpe.com. Download the app, take a short quiz, and get your CPE certificate. Continuing education has never been so easy. And now, on to the episode.
Hello and welcome to Oh My Fraud, a true crime podcast where greed is good, but mostly it's good for just a few people and really bad for everyone else. I'm Caleb Newquist.
And I'm Greg Kyte.
Greg, how are you?
I'm great.
You look good.
Thanks.
Yeah. Feeling good?
Feeling tired. I've been working with my maintenance guys at my building this week, so I've been realizing how good of a decision it was for me to pick a career where I get to sit in front of a computer instead of push a broom all day.
Getting those soft hands some real action, huh, Greg?
Exactly. Yep.
All right. Well, here, if you're feeling a little out of sorts, I've got a review to read, a positive review, a 5-star review.
Great.
Are you ready?
Yeah, love it.
Okay. This comment comes from the Earmark app, from the Cardinal Sins episode. That's number 67. From Douglas. He rated it 5 stars, but said, "You did not have to be so disrespectful throughout to Catholics." And I think I know what's going on here, Greg.
Yeah.
Douglas enjoyed the podcast so much that he rated it 5 stars, but then his Catholic guilt got to him and he felt that he needed to contradict his rating with a mild scold. That's what I think what happened here.
I think that's a pretty reasonable assumption there. And look, Douglas, I get it. As a Catholic, you have a lot of time to listen to podcasts because you almost never actually go to church. And as a resident of the state of Utah, I feel like I have a lot in common with Catholics because neither of us are Mormon. We're on the same team. Douglas, it was just friendly fire. So really, I think he knew it was friendly fire.
Yeah.
So I think that's where the 5 stars came from.
Well, thanks, Douglas, for the rating and the review.
Yeah, and the rebuke.
Well done.
If you're a conflicted Catholic who likes Oh My Fraud and also likes Pope Benedict XVI, take a minute to write us a review. It could be something like, "Forgive me for I have sinned. It has been 2 weeks since I last listened to Oh My Fraud. Here's 5 stars and 3 Hail Marys." That would be great. I would read that all day long on the podcast.
I would totally read the Hail Mary review on Apple or Earmark or wherever it may show up.
Yeah, send us an audio file of the Hail Marys. We'll play that on at the very end of the episode.
Yeah. Okay. Anyway, I'll just quickly mention that if you or your organization would like a fun and informative presentation on fraud or ethics, you're in luck because we do fun and informative live presentations on fraud and ethics.
And we do webinars too. And not to toot our own horns, but our webinars do not suck. Or maybe your conference needs a keynote that'll wake everybody up. We do keynote presentations. Send us an email at ohmyfraud@earmarkcpe.com to get more information on our pricing and our availability. All right. Okay.
Excellent. Greg, do you remember our first episode of 2024?
I absolutely do.
For
good. 2 reasons. One, it was a very memorable episode, and I felt like it kind of got us out a little bit. I mean, still fraud, but not just right down Main Street for what we usually cover.
Yeah.
And also, I remember it because you reminded me about it like 100 times in the days leading up to today's recording.
I'm glad I was getting through. Getting through to you.
Yeah.
Right. And so I guess for the audience, then I'll just remind, if you're new here, I'll just remind everyone, or I will inform people that are new here, that it was about Freedman's Bank. It's episode 51. This was a Reconstruction Era bank that was established for newly freed African Americans in the aftermath of the Civil War. But this bank ultimately collapsed due to mismanagement and fraud.
And if I'm not mistaken, it is the oldest story that we've ever done on Oh My Fraud, but also I think it's fair to say that it's one of the more obscure stories that we've ever done. The story of Freedman's Bank is just not that well known.
Yeah, and that's why I think this episode is so exciting. Greg, you and I had the great privilege to talk to a historian who has recently published a book on Freedman's Bank. Her name is Justene Hill Edwards. She is an associate professor of history in the Corcoran Department of History at the University of Virginia. Her work and scholarship focuses on African American history, American slavery, and the history of American capitalism. Her new book is called Savings and Trust, The Rise and Betrayal of the Freedman's Bank, and you can get it wherever you get books. And Greg, I can't say enough about this conversation we had. It was fantastic.
It was. Justine's the first historian that we've ever had on the podcast. It's not something you would necessarily expect to find on a fraud podcast, but we were excited that she agreed to come and talk to us about Freedman's Bank and her new book, and to shed some additional light on the story that is from a long time ago. And I felt honored that she spent some time with us, and I felt like I learned a ton from her, not just about this fraud, but about a lot of things.
Yeah, me too. So let's get into it then. Here's our interview with Justene Hill Edwards. The way we like to start this off is if you could just give us kind of your life summary in just a few minutes to get things started. How did you become who you are today and ending up on this podcast?
Sure. Well, first, thank you for having me. I most certainly did listen to the Freedman's Bank episode, and so I'm happy to be here. Talking about the book and just kind of exploring the bank's history, because I think it's really fascinating.
What grade did we get, by the way?
Oh, a strong B.
Okay, good. We'll take it.
Yeah,
we'll take it.
Yep. That still counts for graduation. We'll take that.
Good. Okay.
But yeah, I am originally from Northern California. I'm from Oakland, and I really wasn't a history buff. I was always a very studious person, kind of a nerd. I love to read and write, and but history and being a historian was never on my radar. I mean, I have friends and colleagues who will say that they knew that they wanted to be a historian since the first time they went to Gettysburg when they were 7, and that just wasn't me. But in college, I went to Swarthmore College in Philadelphia, outside of Philadelphia. I became really interested in Black studies and African American history. I subsequently was going to go to law school, decided not to because I worked at a law firm and didn't really want to practice law. It really was not my calling.
Yeah.
But I ended up getting a master's degree in African diaspora studies, and then I went on to Princeton to get my PhD in African American history, and that's where I really decided to train and be trained as a historian of slavery. My first book is called Unfree Markets, and I looked at the economic lives and activities of the enslaved in South Carolina. And so I was really interested in these overlapping histories of slavery and the rise of capitalism through looking at the strategies that slaves used to make money, to trade, to kind of engage in the economic lives of the communities that they lived in. And I was really interested in the fact that the enslaved had money, the enslaved were trading, the enslaved were oftentimes kind of selling goods to their enslavers. And this was kind of an underexplored aspect of the history of slavery, and really the micro history of the rise of American capitalism. But at the end of that process, as I was starting my job here at the University of Virginia and being a historian, being an academic, we're constantly thinking about next projects. And so my husband, he worked in DC, and he would kind of walk around the White House complex at lunch. And one day around 2016, he asks me about the Freedman's Bank, because at that time a plaque had just been placed outside of the Treasury Annex for the Freedman's Bank, kind of recognizing it as the location where the bank once stood. And so I told him, yeah, I mean, it was a bank, it was founded during Reconstruction, but it didn't last very long. And that was about it. And so as I kind of started to think again about next projects and about just what I wanted to work on next, the Freedman's Bank quickly kind of rose up to being that next project, because I was really surprised that not many historians had written about it. I mean, there are so many books about the war, about Lincoln, but there were only 2 books written about the Freedman's Bank. The last one was published in 1976, and the one before that was published in 1927. And there are a handful of book chapters by amazing historians, but no real updated history. And so I thought this was a great time. I was in a great position to write this book based on my training. And so that's how I came to write a book about the Freedman's Bank.
Nice.
Cool.
And then help me just get a little better context, because we're going so far back, because we've done a lot of cases about fraud that have been, I want to say the earliest ones are still in the 1900s, but we're talking 1800s for this, and I feel like I've got very little context for what normal life was for anybody in the 1800s. Would the average American and I'm just going to say, like, the average American white person in this time, would they be using bank services at that time? How prevalent was banking? I imagine they're not trying to get 1.5% cash back on their purchases on Delta.
No.
Okay.
Well, I mean, this is a part of this story too that I think is fascinating. Banking in this period in the 19th century was very different. Savings banking was very, very different. The quote unquote average American, even the average white American didn't have access to a bank account, a savings account.
Okay.
And actually the kind of foundations for savings banking really emerged in the early 19th century. And so the first savings bank was actually established in Philadelphia in 1816. And those banks were created to be benevolent institutions, meaning that they were supposed to operate essentially like a nonprofit. They were supposed to provide very simple financial services, banking services, mostly to the poor and working classes. And so the idea that a bank was created for the population of recently emancipated African Americans in this period, especially after the war, was extraordinary.
Was the main service just that I've got some cash and it's not safe in my home, so I need some place that can lock it down? Is that what I mean? Again, that's me having watched Westerns. That's
Sure.
That's all.
Kind of. I mean, these banks were established again for a variety of reasons. One was in some ways these banks were created to fulfill the philanthropic goals of the wealthy. And so they wanted to kind of help the poor learn how to save or thrift, as they would call it. And so these institutions were created to kind of alleviate poverty. And so most depositors in this period, especially of savings banks, weren't actually depositing that much money. We're talking about a couple of dollars. But these institutions were created, again, to help inspire the poor and working classes to develop the habit of saving.
Right. Crazy to think that banks, at their beginning, they were to help the poor and they were philanthropic in nature, because that's
savings banks were.
Okay.
And this is part of the story as well. Like we have to separate what we might consider a commercial bank, a quote unquote for-profit bank, from a savings bank, which again operated kind of like a nonprofit institution.
Gotcha.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. Okay. I'm just curious, before we get into the actual story, do you remember when you first heard about Freedman's Bank?
Ooh, not really.
Okay.
But I mean, I'm a historian. I've been reading in this period for a very long time. I'm sure I read about it when I was preparing for my comprehensive exams in graduate school, and that's when you read hundreds of books to get a sense of kind of what's been written. And so, yes, I'm sure I came across it at a particular point, but it really was not on my radar until about 2015, 2016.
Okay. Very cool. Mm-hmm. So, I think this is probably a good spot to like get into the story. Would you say, Greg?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay,
yes.
cool. So, we obviously, you're plugging a book, so we want
Yes.
people to get interested and to go out and buy it. And by the way, I just got to part 3 for what it's worth. But I'm wondering.
Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah. So I'm wondering, can you kind of walk us through the story, in such a way that you're giving us the whole picture, or you're giving the audience the whole picture, but also, saving some of the good bits so that when they read the book, they're still surprised.
Sure. I will try to make it as dramatic as possible.
Okay, great.
Nice.
Well, I will take you to 1864. And so this is at the end of the Civil War. At this point, nothing is certain. The idea that slavery, it's on its kind of slow death, is not really certain, but there are hundreds of thousands of recently emancipated African Americans in the South. This is also a period of time when you see tens of thousands, soon to be hundreds of thousands of Black men enlist in the Union military to serve.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're getting paid for the first time. Their pay is actually on par with whites, which is amazing. And this is a period of time for the war. And so they are struggling with what to do with their money. By and large, they want to be able to save money and send money back to their families, but they have no place to put it. They're giving their commanding officers money to hold for safekeeping. And so there's all of this kind of money being earned by Black men. And so you have 3 Union generals decide to create what are called military savings banks. There are 3, one in Norfolk, one in Beaufort, and one in New Orleans. And so these banks were created to help African American soldiers save money. And so these banks were actually fairly successful. In its first year, I think the Norfolk Bank had about $65,000 in deposits. And that is kind of extraordinary if you think about the fact that we are talking about men who were, by and large, formerly enslaved. And so into the story comes a man named John Alvord. And he is a white minister from the North, from Connecticut. And he is traveling along with the military at this time, kind of taking the opportunity to speak to as many African Americans as possible. He is an abolitionist. He is dedicated to the abolitionist cause. And so he is talking to African Americans, and what he learns quickly is that they want a few things. They want to rejoin their families. And they want the opportunity to buy land because they understand fundamentally that in order to kind of make this transition to this period of freedom, which is new, they need to establish kind of an economic safety net. And that is land, that's property. Yep. And so Alvord is traveling around. He gets a sense that perhaps he can help. And so at the beginning of 1865, he travels to New York and he gathers a group of about 50 white abolitionists, ministers, politicians, and bankers. And he introduces them to the idea of creating what was called the Freedman Savings and Trust Company, what we call the Freedman's Bank. And so this is kind of where the story begins in terms of thinking about the first stages of the creation of this really important savings bank for the recently enslaved.
And that's one of the things that in the early part of the book that you use this phrasing a few times and it just jumped off the page at me, which is the practicalities of freedom, right? Where and we talked about this a little bit in our episode, but the recently freed African Americans, the practical notion of freedom was foreign to them, and they had to, and how they moved through the world and how they operated kind of in the world on a day-to-day basis was something that they had to learn. And I think that's such a hard thing to put into context and kind of get your head around. And but having a place to put your money that they were now earning, that's a very practical thing, like in everyday life, that we all like, that we just take for granted now, that we've taken for granted for decades. And so that's that is a very, that's a I don't know, that's the part I find myself trying to put myself back in a time where this is not something that you could take for granted. You had to figure out practically how that would work, and it made a lot of sense. And so this is kind of how it started in this instance.
Quick question before we get too far. So the military banks that you talked about, were those specifically for African American soldiers, or were those for anybody in the military?
They were created for African American soldiers, but in one of the banks, the New Orleans branch in particular, there were whites as well, white soldiers who used the bank's services. And so, but that is kind of important foreshadowing, because the Freedman's Bank, yes, it's established for the recently emancipated, but about 10% of the depositors ended up being white. And this is for a variety of reasons that we can talk about a little bit later.
Cool. Right on.
So Alvord, he gets these people together, people that have money, people that have influence, people that they're abolitionists, so they believe in they believe in the cause. What kind of what actually has to happen for branches to start opening, for the banks to open and start operating? Sure.
Well, so John Alvord ends up traveling to Washington in February of 1865 to kind of rally political support. He talks to members of Congress. He talks to members of the Lincoln administration, and he's essentially trying to rally some support for this bank. And so on March 3rd of 1865, Lincoln signs the Freedmen's Bank Act, and this is a bank act to essentially establish the bank. And so what happens is that the bank kind of starts out gradually. They have a charter, they have a congressional and executive support. And so the bank kind of starts off. It starts off slow. The first branches are essentially kind of tapped into from these military savings banks. But what the bank's administrators essentially have to do is to travel around the South to convince African Americans to open accounts if they choose to open a bank branch in that particular city. And the branches were specific in places with a high Black population. And so we're talking about places like Richmond, Lynchburg, Virginia, Savannah, Georgia, New Orleans, of course, Charleston, South Carolina. And so places with a high concentration of African Americans.
Gotcha. So, and so things went wonderfully. Lots of people gave deposits. They made a modest amount of interest and built generational wealth that is still enjoyed to this day. So It's been great. It's been great having you on the podcast. Right? Is that?
I wish.
I haven't gotten quite as far into the book as Caleb has, I guess. So.
So the bank's kind of expansion starts out slowly, and it is worth saying that the Freedmen's Bank is one of the first banks to operate under a new kind of regulatory infrastructure. And so we're talking about the creation of the nation's first financial regulator, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. We're talking about the creation and ratification of the National Banking Act of 1863 and 664, which creates kind of a national currency. Because prior to this time, states were responsible for chartering banks, which meant that there were thousands of banks, and each bank had its own specific currency, right? So we're talking about a period of time where where the nation is shifting to one standard currency. We're also a nation kind of emerging out of war debt. Wars are expensive to finance. And so Congress is trying to figure out, well, how do we pay down our debt? How do we raise capital? How do we shift to using a standard currency? And the Freedmen's Bank is created kind of in this moment, which actually kind of is a great thing in terms of the bank's ability to expand rapidly, especially in its first 2 and 3 years. But what it means is that there's essentially no regulation. The comptroller was supposed to regulate national banks, and the Freedmen's Bank is established as a national bank, right? There's one main bank branch, and there are other branches throughout the nation. But because the bank is kind of allowed to expand so quickly at its height, there are 37 branches across 17 states. There's actually lax regulation because Congress was supposed to be responsible for managing the bank. But kind of that aside, African Americans are kind of slow to embrace the bank, but that kind of expands rapidly. And so by 1867, the branch there are a variety of branches with hundreds of thousands of dollars in branch deposits. And just so that I get my numbers right, by 1867, the branch has about $1.3 million in deposits,
Wow.
which again is outstanding if you think about the fact that most depositors were formerly enslaved.
Right. And also even, I mean, thinking about I'm assuming that's still in 1860s dollars, not in 2024 dollars. So if you brought that with inflation to today, it'd be, I'm assuming, billions of dollars.
Well, as of March of 1867, that would be about $1.6 million, about $33.2 million today.
Okay. Yeah.
Which again is outstanding
It
if you
is.
think
Yeah.
about the population that we're talking about.
Absolutely.
So there's early success, and
Yes.
I'm sure a lot of excitement, and I imagine that John Alvord is feeling really good, like that he feels like that
Yes.
they're realizing the mission that they set out to. Well, they haven't realized, but they are on the right path into helping the emancipated slaves begin to giving them economic freedom and economic responsibility, and that's what they want. And as you said, with the hopes, kind of with the longer term goals of acquiring land, acquiring assets in order to again build financial independence. So what kind of happens next? It sounds like the expansion happens rapidly. And so what kind of, as things continue to evolve, what happens next?
Sure. Well, again, the bank expands rapidly, and the challenge with this is the core of the bank's infrastructure. And so the bank was chartered to just accept deposits and give a modest rate of return. At this point, it was about 3 to 5%, which at this point is still pretty high. But there is high overhead because, of course, you have branches. Some branches purchased buildings outright. Some rented space. Each branch had a cashier, and the cashier was essentially the branch manager, and that person was paid. And so to run a bank with multiple branches was fairly expensive. And the bank's charter, as approved by Congress, only said that the bank could invest about a third of deposits. And those investments were supposed to be in the lowest risk type of financial products, which were government bonds and securities. And so the bank's investments weren't really giving the rate of return in a way that made the bank profitable. There was high overhead, and the bank's administrators were kind of lax, right? Again, this was established as a benevolent institution. It was essentially charity. especially on the part of the bank's administrators and the bank's board of trustees. And so this starts to kind of shift fairly quickly. And so in 1867, John Alvord, who is on the bank's executive board, he's a secretary at this point, and then ascends to being the bank's vice president. He introduces the idea of moving the bank's main office from New York, where it was adjacent to Wall Street, to Washington, D.C. And so this is a big deal because most of the bank's main trustees were from and worked in New York. And so they slowly started to kind of say no to their administrative responsibilities with the bank. And so by shifting from New York to D.C., it shifts to the kind of hub of political power. And Alvord convinces a kind of a new crop of trustees to join the bank's board. And it is worth saying at this point, the entire board of trustees were white. And so at this point, when the bank shifts to DC, he encourages a new kind of cadre of businessmen to join, the most important of whom was Henry Cook. And so I'm not sure if you know who Henry Cook was or heard of the name Cook, but Henry Cook was the savvy brother of famed investment banker Jay Cook. And Jay Cook was the founder of Jay Cook and Company, the nation's first investment bank. And the Cook brothers had cultivated very strong ties and relationships to members of the Lincoln administration because during the war, they were responsible for engaging in a massive bond sale. They were responsible for raising billions of dollars of capital to help fund the war effort. And so Henry Cook was not a banker necessarily. He was at first a lawyer and then a publisher, but he was a shrewd lobbyist and essentially a shrewd politician at this point. And so he joins the board of trustees in the spring of 1867. At this point, he is the president of the First National Bank, and that is the DC branch of Jay Cook and Company. And he brings with him two men, William Huntington and a man named D.L. Eaton. And he chooses to be the board's actuary. And when D.L. Eaton accepts the position of the board's actuary, he actually does something that I claim kind of shifts the fundamental mission of the bank. 2 days before he accepts the position, he takes the first illegal loan from the bank of $1,000. Now,
right.
Illegal. Yeah,
yes.
so go ahead.
Go ahead, Greg. Go
Okay,
ahead.
so first off, as you saw from our reaction, it's like, wait, an illegal loan, but I'm assuming it's illegal because, like you said earlier, the bank was only allowed to invest, a third of its deposits and only in the safest securities. So the bank specifically was precluded from any loan. So any loan is an illegal loan, right?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. And
Right.
the person responsible for evaluating the bank's kind of risk profile takes the first illegal loan.
Oh, nice. Well, also, it's funny that you said, the way you said it was Eaton chooses to be their actuary. And I'm like going, I know enough about being an actuary that you maybe need to be trained and you just get to go, hey, who wants to be the actuary? Someone's like, me, I guess. Can I guess I'll do it. So, yeah.
Yeah. And the loan.
Do I get illegal loans? I'll do it if I get illegal loans.
Yes. But again, this is a huge deal, right? The fact that 2 years into the bank's tenure, he takes a loan and he pays it back a few weeks later. But still, I mean, this is a huge deal. It is illegal, and what happens is that this, I think, kind of chips away at the bank's fundamental mission. Again, the bank is a pure savings bank, the kind of most boring type of financial institution. And by taking a loan, he kind of corrupts the bank's, again, very benevolent mission to serve the recently emancipated. And so And so this is a shift, right? The move to DC to add Cook to the bank's board. And it's important to note too that Cook becomes the bank's the chairman of the bank's finance committee, and the finance committee again is responsible for investing a third of the bank's deposits, and so this shifts, and so at this time too, a year later, John Alvord becomes the bank's president, and so he is in an interesting position. He's a Freedman's Bank president, but he's also working for the Freedman's Bureau, and the Freedman's Bureau is kind of it is an important kind of federal institution that was made responsible for negotiating work contracts between the formerly enslaved and white employers. They were just distributing land. It was a really important institution at this time. And so John Alvord was not only a bank president, he was also kind of working for the Freedman's Bureau. And again, I think it is important to note that John Alvord was not a banker. Mm-hmm. He didn't really know much about finance. At this time, his family's finances were kind of not great.
Mm-hmm. But could he be an actuary? That's really what we need to know.
Could he be an actuary? No, he most certainly was not.
Okay.
He was not a banker. He was most certainly not an actuary either. And so this kind of shifts things. And at this time, the bank's board of trustees want to build a new, glorious, beautiful building. And so they embark on the very expensive project of building a main office of the Freedman's Bank, and that office is subsequently positioned right in front of the Department of Treasury, right adjacent to the White House. And so they're on this kind of spree of spending money. Increasingly, they start to illegally lend money. And this is a period of time when in 1869, the Board of Trustees says, hey, why don't we actually start to make some of this legal? And so they lobby members of Congress.
They're like, hey, get together. You know how we're doing all this stuff illegally and it's working out so great? Maybe, just to dot some I's and cross some T's.
Exactly.
Jeez.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so Henry Cook lobbies his friends and colleagues in Congress. And in May of 1870, members of Congress approve of an amendment to allow the Freedman's Bank to not operate as a savings bank, to essentially allow it to operate as a commercial bank, to make bank loans.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. And if I remember correctly, there were some warning signs at this stage, right? Like it wasn't as though there was some debate about whether or not this was a good idea. Like the bank wanted to do it, but even within Congress, there were, I believe, if I remember right, there were senators, there were people that were involved in the legislative process that were saying, this isn't what you all set out to do. So why is this happening now? Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And this is a period of time too. We think that Congress was partisan now, but it was then too.
Right.
Especially in this period in the late 1860s, you have Democrats starting to trickle back into Congress. You have really kind of powerful political voices saying, look, I'm not sure if allowing the Freedman's Bank to make loans is a good idea. As we all know, to allow those with money interest to tap into these deposits, it may not be a great idea because it could be open to plunder.
Yeah, right.
But I've got to assume that the other argument for making the loans goes back to what you were saying before, where it's like the Freedman's Bank was having a difficult time being profitable. So I could see them using that, going, hey, this is a great idea. We're doing some great work. We're really helping some people, but we're not profitable. If you allow us to make these loans that we absolutely have been making before this time, so don't ask.
But we're not going to talk about that.
But if we could make these loans, then maybe we could actually become a profitable bank and continue the mission. That's an assumption. Was that part of the argument that was made? Do you know?
Yes, that was absolutely what Henry Cook said.
Okay.
He said that if we can kind of diversify our investment portfolio, then at the end of the day, this will only go to benefit African Americans who are putting their money in these accounts, entrusting us with their deposits for this bank. And so, yes, that was absolutely a contention that he was making, and it was convincing because on the surface, yes, rationally, that made sense.
So when did the pillaging start?
1867. No.
Okay.
The legal pillaging started almost immediately.
Oh.
Yeah, and so looking at these accounting records was fascinating because once May 1870 happens, you see kind of $2,000, $5,000, $500 just kind of flowing out of the bank, and each of these loans were supposed to be secured by real estate collateral, 2 times the value of the loan.
And real estate only, is that right?
Yes, real estate only.
Okay.
Which also meant that the bank was kind of constrained to only lend to people in and around DC, because that's where the bank's main office was. That's where the board of trustees were. But increasingly, people who wanted to borrow money started to use stocks and bonds to secure their loans, which again was illegal, but nobody was examining the bank at this time. The comptroller was not examining or regulating this bank now, and so it was just allowed to happen.
One of the things that I remember from when we did our podcast before about Freedman's Bank was because and it sounds like this might have been part of the reason why we only got a B for the episode, but we found some numbers.
A strong B.
We're trying to pull it up today. This is our we're retaking the test today. But it was the idea that, and again, these were the numbers that we found, where Freedman's Bank was giving returns to their depositors of 6%, whereas these loans that they were giving to other people were only earning them 5%.
Exactly.
And so and also wasn't there some internal dealing with the cooks as well, where they were and even anyways, so first off, I go in today's day and age, like I remember at my work, we do a lot of banking at my day job. And I remember when we first got a loan that got down as low as 5.2%. That was back in like 2012. We got a 5.2, and everybody's like going, "Oh my gosh, 5.2! This is unheard of. This is the lowest rate anyone's seen in their lifetime." Well,
Yeah.
And we had parties and things like that because of this 5.2%.
People get excited about interest rates.
Yeah,
I mean, of
but-
course, especially especially interest rates.
But then I think also once those interest rates that people were paying on loans were so low, all of a sudden savings returns were like nothing. And so I've got to go, okay, if savings returns were 6% for formerly enslaved people who, again, I've got to assume are probably not getting the best rates on their savings just because of everything that was going on at that time, then if you're getting 6% on your savings and somebody's borrowing at 5%, that must be a dream loan to get a 5% loan from a bank. Am I onto something with that?
Yes, you are. But I think the important part of this, though, is that I talk about in the book the kind of asymmetry of expectations, right? What the white bank administrators hoped in terms of depositor behavior and what African Americans wanted the bank to do for them. One of the problems was that white bank administrators wanted African Americans to leave their money in the bank for a specific period of time, a year, 2 years. African Americans didn't want to. They wanted to put money in their bank accounts, have it be safe. They didn't care about accruing interest. They wanted safety and reliability, not interest payments. And so they would leave their money in the bank for a few months and then withdraw when they had enough to buy what they really wanted, which was land and machinery.
Okay.
And so that was kind of a struggle as well. A lot of the marketing material that I talk about in the book were just like really encouraging African Americans to leave their money in the bank for longer periods of time. But African Americans didn't care about that. They only wanted safety and reliability above all else, not interest payments.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, but at some point there was even a run on one of the banks that it was a little bit. I think I'm going back in time a little bit, but there was actually a run on one of the banks, which again, John Alvord not having any banking experience is slightly problematic because I mean what's crazy is that in about 170 years of history or 160 years of history, we're still having runs on banks. And so like, it's one of those things that is the puzzle of banking is keeping money in it, but also loaning it to people so that the bank can operate. And it is kind of the operational kind of balance of banking is very tricky. But in this case, in Freedman's bank, it doesn't sound like they were all too concerned about that. It really kind of got out of hand really quick. As you've already said, it got out of hand really quickly. Like the loans started flying once they had once they revised the charter, the loans really started like just flying out the door.
Flying out. And I mean, it got to a point when African Americans could not access the money that they had put into their accounts because so much of it was being sent to DC
right,
for all of this loan making. And part of this too, writing this book has been a really interesting kind of study of economic behavior. Because I had to put myself in the mindset of a recently emancipated African American person, and thinking about everything that I know about slavery, everything I know about the really precarious transition to this period of freedom, the violence, the unpredictability of Reconstruction. And so, of course, yes, they wanted, again, a safe place to put their money. They kind of didn't care about anything else in terms of their interactions with the bank. And so yes, there would be runs. I mean, any fear about not being able to have access to their money would kind of spur a bank run, which of course makes sense because we're right. Like if there's fears that someone could not access their life savings, why wouldn't they kind of flood bank branches to try to withdraw money as quickly as possible?
Right. Especially considering what you just said, that the main things that we're looking for was safety and reliability. So if you're going, maybe at least the reliability is maybe going away and possibly the safety, then all of a sudden you got no motivation to keep your money there.
Okay. So just to kind of reset where we're at in the story, loans are flying out the door. We've got some very opportunistic trustees running this bank. They changed the charter. The loans are flying out the door. Are there are there any, like, I guess what is kind of the next phase of kind of this lending bonanza that's going on?
Sure. No, that is the title of one of my chapters. I'm like, I recognize that.
It was in my subconscious.
I recognize that name.
Yes, it was a bonanza.
So what happens next is this brings us to 1872. And there is a trustee. His name is Edgar Ketchum. And he is very... he questions Cook and Cook's strategies, especially his lending strategies. He's seeing that Cook is borrowing lots of money, kind of exchanging bad loans for loans that he has on his books. And he's essentially using the bank as his kind of personal slush fund. At this point, Cook and his brother are trying to sell bonds to help fund the Northern Pacific Railroad. And so in the past, during the war, they had a fair amount of success raising money and raising capital in Western Europe. By 1872, that kind of stops. And so they are kind of struggling financially. And Ketchum sees this and essentially calls Cook to pay back his loans.
So
yes.
is Ketchum, is he like an internal auditor? Because I so badly want an internal auditor to be named Ketchum.
I know. I didn't even think about that. That's so... Man, I think I was like so in the book. This is the first time actually. What a great name. Yeah.
He tried. Did he? Okay. I just want to know. Did he caught him, but maybe not. So continue.
No, I mean he catches Cook. He basically calls his bluff and says, "We need you to pay your loans because it's overdue. You're over leveraged. We're over leveraged as a bank. You need to pay this." And so instead of paying it back, Cook steps down from the bank. Jeez. Which is not funny. It's just so true. Like, of course he does. Of course he steps down.
Classy.
Classic Cook.
It's one of those. It's. I love a fraud story. I love a fraud story where someone is confronted with all the evidence that they are committing fraud, and they're like, "I'm just gonna go to the bathroom. I'll be right back," and then they never come back.
And then he doesn't come back. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so Cook is busted.
Yes.
By Ketchum.
By Ketchum. What a great
catches
name.
him.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And
so he steps down.
And so he steps down. And this brings us to 1873. The bank is still lending out money by the
right. So, like, what's the public perception at this point for the bank?
Well, the bank's marketing strategy is actually pretty good. The bank consistently markets in Black newspapers throughout the South. They constantly are telling African Americans how much money is being put in the bank, tens of millions of dollars by this point. And so from a public facing perspective, the bank seems to be doing well.
Huge success. Yeah.
Yeah. African Americans are extremely proud of this institution that they are putting. And again, the bank is constantly advertising how much money African Americans are putting in the bank. And so this brings us to February of 1873. And finally, the comptroller decides to examine the bank. It's under a mandate to examine all of the banks in and around DC, and the Freedman's Bank is that first bank on the list. And so in February of 1873, a report is released by the comptroller, and it's pretty damning. It basically says kind of that the bank is over leveraged, there are bank runs, the books are not as well kept as they should be, individual branch cashiers are operating with kind of impunity at this point. And so the bank's board of trustees needs to kind of right the ship. And so this happens, and African Americans kind of start to get scared. But at the end, the comptroller, Charles Meigs, he says, "But I have every faith and confidence that the bank's board of trustees can redeem themselves and reestablish the trust that they had previously." And so that's what happens. Kind of this takes us to September of 1873. And so in September of 1873, we encounter the failure of J. Cook and Company. J. Cook and Company declares bankruptcy, and this is like a lightning bolt. News kind of spreads fairly quickly. Henry Cook is in DC at this time. He absconds to Philadelphia, where J. Cook and Company is, and there are runs on the Freedman's Bank, of course, because African Americans are hearing about the bankruptcy of this really big, important bank. They are scared about what this means for them, and so they start to make bank runs. And of course, a bank run is a horrible thing for a bank, because it kind of illuminates what's going on internally in the bank's infrastructure.
Well, and especially you don't want to bank run where your depositors are pulling out of their money at the same time that I'm assuming one of their biggest debtors just so it's like, well, we can't. Yeah, we there's no way to get that money, not just because it's tied up in a loan, but the guy those folks are no good for it anymore. So everybody. So at this point, just everybody's screwed. Is that
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And depositors know that Henry Cook was affiliated with the bank, but was still kind of connected to it. And so, and so this is a scary position to put them in.
Yeah, for sure. One of the things, another one of the just the data points that sticks out to me from when we did the podcast before was once every, and maybe this is premature in us telling the story, but was at this point that it was found out that like the Freedman's bank's assets were only like 2% of what their loans were out to the to the world. So
yeah, I mean they had so small of an amount of money on hand, kind of currency and bonds, that it was clear that the finance committee was just kind of sending money out the door to anyone they wanted to give it to.
And we would really just look at that as being grossly over leveraged. Would that
grossly
be
over leveraged?
Yeah, I mean maybe grossly is not even a dramatic enough term for that.
Yeah.
So you're grossly over leveraged, and you've got a run, and you've got a failure of one of it. Am I correct that Cook and Company they've got to be at least a very material part of the loans that were put out. Were they like the main borrower from the bank?
Biggest, yes.
They were the biggest. Okay.
They did not get the biggest single loan, but they were by far by loan volume the biggest. Yes.
Right. So the African American community that had invested, not invested, but just trusted the bank with their deposits, how much, if we're talking, they're obviously not getting all their money back out of the bank. What percentage is the average depositor getting back of the money that they put in?
Do you mean in 1873 or in the next year, 1874?
Let's go. Walk. It sounds like a journey. Let's go on that journey.
They're like 3 steps until.
Okay.
So we have, from the fall of J. Cook and Company, the Panic of 1873, and this is a depression, and so the bank's board of trustees decide to tell Alvord that he has to step down, and so he steps down as president in February of 1874. He's still on the board of trustees, but he's no longer the president. And this is when they ask the most famous African American person in America to be the bank's president. And so in March of 1874, Frederick Douglass says yes and accepts the position as the president of the Freedmen's Bank.
So, just for the audience, for the sake of the audience, because I think Frederick Douglass is like, it's someone that everyone hears about in history class at some point, right? But I'm wondering if you can put him into context, like who he is, what he did, and why he was so prominent at this time.
Sure. So Frederick Douglass was an enslaved person, born and raised in Maryland. And when he is a late teen, he escapes with his freedom. And so he is essentially a fugitive slave for the rest of the period of slavery. And he travels across the Atlantic, and he kind of speaks in the abolitionist circuit. And he is essentially the most famous Black abolitionist in America. During the war, he is an advocate for Black men and kind of military service. He founds an important abolitionist newspaper. He is just an incredibly influential person in the U.S. during the 19th century.
But just to stop you for a second, but he also went to Europe and spoke about it as well. So it's like he has international.
Yes,
he's internationally renowned. Okay, wow.
Yes, he is the most photographed American of the 19th century. He's constantly sitting for paintings and portraits and photos. And so, yes, he is incredibly recognizable, which is why we have so many pictures of him. And so he is an early supporter of the Freedmen's Bank. He encourages African Americans to open accounts. He moves to D.C. in 1871 and opens and runs a Black newspaper there. And this newspaper paper is constantly talking about and writing about the Freedmen's Bank. And so he is a big advocate.
Yeah.
And so he joins the bank, and he is the president at this period of time when he essentially has to just decide kind of steps to move forward. It was at this time too that the second examination comes out in February of 1874, and it is again pretty damning. It's a more robust one. The comptroller sends examiners to about 11 branches to examine their books, and the report is again really damning, essentially saying that African Americans are essentially doing what they're supposed to do. They're putting money in the bank, they're saving, but African Americans know that all of this money is being lent out in DC. And in one particular branch, I talk about this in the St. Louis branch, the examiner writes that African Americans know that the bank is essentially a dragnet. That's the term that he uses, and that the money would be much better spent if it could be invested in the communities in which the banks reside. And so this is kind of a stark reminder for the Board of Trustees. And Douglas comes in kind of understanding this. And so he sits down with the board, he sits down and looks at the books and realizes quickly that the bank is in an untenable position, that by this point, about $3.5 million had been lent out in funds. About 75% of that loan volume was overdue, which means that
Wait, say that again. Say that number.
Yeah, about 75% of the loan volume was overdue.
Okay.
Which meant that those who were borrowing money were strategically not paying back their loans from the Freedmen's Bank, which I just think is insane.
No, it is at that level. At that level, it isn't just. It's not an accident.
Yeah,
it seems it's too widespread and it's too systemic to think, well, this is just a couple people going through a rough patch. It's like no. There's something else at play here.
And that's just, I mean, all of these data points like that from the upside down, the reverse arbitrage that they're getting from their lending, from the vastly gross, over leveraging to the 75% of the loans being behind on their payments. Mm-hmm. It's like who's running the bank? That's just the level of either negligence or incompetence or both.
I think it was both. Yeah,
that's happening at the bank,
mm-hmm.
or to put a different lens on it, and I'm sure this has to be part of it. Just the exploitation that's happening is a little bit depressing.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, and so I mean, Douglas attempts to assure depositors that he is in a position to make things right, but ultimately he can't. The malfeasance was just too widespread. Mm-hmm. And so in June of 1874, Congress intervenes, and kind of forces the board of trustees to make a plan to close the bank. And so they do on July 2nd of 1874. And again, they're about $3.5 million in loans outstanding. And depositors had due about $2.9 million in money that they had deposited in the bank. And so that was spread across about 61,000 depositors, which just kind of gives you a sense of, again, the kind of broad scale of the malfeasance that was happening, especially in the latter years.
So now give us the autopsy. What was anybody able to get money out of the bank?
So there were 5 disbursements, but we're not talking about the entire contents of deposits. And so the first one was about 15%, and then it went as high as 20 and as low as 5. And so a majority of depositors who still had money in their accounts did not get the entirety of their money back. Which
So
again, yeah. Mhm.
So best case scenario, you lost 80% of your money.
Yes, best case.
Ugh.
And there were all of these hurdles that depositors had to jump over to get money. They had to send in a bank book, which was basically an accounting of how much money they had in their account. They had to send it to a specific person at a specific time, but these notices were put in newspapers, sometimes not in Black newspapers. And so it was just all of these hurdles that depositors had to kind of go through to get their money. And it ended up being not just a hassle, but kind of a shame in terms of the fact that we're talking about, in many cases, the life savings of African Americans, again, who recently emerged from slavery.
But they could all take comfort in the fact that Alvord and both the Cook brothers went to jail and were totally held accountable for all of their actions, right?
I wish that were the
that's
case.
not how it worked out?
I wish that, of course not. We're talking about fraud here.
Bankers, right. Bankers aren't held accountable for their actions.
Bankers and accountability aren't exactly something that I hear a lot about. But anyway, this is, what happened? So what does happen in the aftermath? There is an investigation, correct?
There are kind of 3 investigations, one an immediate post-mortem in 1874, but there are 2 congressional inquiries, one in 1876 and one in 1880. And the first one was held by Virginia Congressman named Beverly Douglas, with 1 S, not 2 S, like Frederick. And he was a former Confederate general, a Democrat, who reemerges in this period and becomes a congressman. And so his reasons for holding a congressional inquiry were not to benefit African Americans. It was essentially to score political points and to show that all of this happened under the control of Republicans in Congress, the party of Lincoln. But he is, again, a former Confederate. He was someone who was a leader in the KKK. And so he was not dedicated to ensuring that African Americans get their money. He essentially wanted a public flogging of Republicans in terms of their handling of the bank. And so the second congressional inquiry is, I think, the more important one. Here, I'm going to see if I can find his picture. One of the first Black senators, actually the second Black senator in the U.S. I'm looking for his picture because I think it's a great one. His name is Blanche K. Bruce. It's a picture of him here.
Oh, yeah.
And he kind of knows that he's on his way out. He's not going to be reelected. And so he chooses to hold a congressional inquiry, and it takes about a year. And so he brings Douglas to testify. He brings Henry Cook to testify. He brings other bank administrators to testify. And essentially what he does is he wants this to be on record, which is great for me as a historian because it's on record. But no one is kind of brought up on charges for malfeasance. If anything, the idea of this is the risk that you take when you want to be fully included in the body politic. This is the responsibility of being kind of a full citizen, is to be able to take and handle risk. Bruce wants to present a different perspective, but again, no one is brought on charges, and those who took loans from the bank were just allowed to take loans and walk free.
And I mean, there's a lot of important things that kind of emerge from this report, right? And including, and I don't remember, keep me honest here, but and I don't think you mentioned it, but even the fact of Douglas becoming the president, that was the trustees did that deliberately because they wanted a black man to be at the head of the bank because the failure was inevitable. They knew the failure was inevitable at that point.
Happen.
And so they thought, oh, we can put the most prominent black man on the earth in charge of this bank, and then he will be the one that people blame for its failure. I don't remember if that came out of this Bruce report or not, but there were all kinds of revelations at this time. And yet no accountability was really handed out in terms of criminal accountability.
Sure. Well, and this I think is kind of an important part to kind of break down. And so at this time, when the bank is kind of on its last legs in 1874, there are a small group of Black trustees.
Mm-hmm.
The most prominent of which was John Mercer Langston, a man who was formerly enslaved in Virginia, the child of his white enslaving father and his Black enslaved mother. He would later become the first Black congressman from Virginia. He's on the board. And Dr. Charles Purvis, the first kind of the first professor of medicine at Howard University, both of whom are Black. They encourage Douglas because they really hope that he can redeem the bank's reputation. They really hope so. The other white trustees, however, are continuing to loan money or taking money for themselves, and essentially know that the bank is going to fail. And so they're fine with Douglas being the bank's president at this time because they anticipate that the bank's going to fail anyway.
So there wasn't even at the administrative level, like trustees, it's clear that the white trustees were not being transparent with their fellow Black trustees who are also charged with governing the bank. But like there is this kind of it's not malfeasance, but I'm saying that they are concealing the fact that they've been making, not only they aren't technically illegal loans now, but they are kind of loaning in ways that are still against the charter because, as you said, it was supposed to be collateral was only supposed to be real estate, for example. Mm-hmm. And so, in a kind of a classic fraud story, there's related party issues, but then there's also conspiracy at play and like all these other things that make it kind of this all happened prior to most of the frauds that we talk about. So this is kind of this is a good example of how fraud is kind of timeless in a way because the behavior and the mechanisms are all pretty familiar in a lot of ways. I just want to ask you, because this has been an amazing conversation. I've learned so much. Can you just talk a little bit about kind of like the legacy of this event? And I think it's important because, as you pointed out at the beginning of the conversation, this isn't a well-known story. And even when like I said, I learned at it in a work setting about kind of the history, the history of really the history of African Americans and their relationship with banking. And I don't know how many people were in that training. There were many people in that training. No one knew this story. Not a single person knew this story. And so I'm just wondering, as a historian, I think part of what you do, again, keep me honest, but like putting the present in proper context based on these past events. So I'm just wondering, what's the long-term impact of this? Because it's massive.
Sure. Well, I think it is worth saying, and I talk about this at the end of the book, that African Americans continue to work into the 1940s, begging attorneys generals, comptrollers, even U.S. presidents for help, for recompense. And so this is a story that does not end in 1874. It does not end in 1911 when the final congressman introduces a bill to help compensate depositors, right? There is this question, I think, of kind of trust. And again, I talk about this in the book, that we have all of these kind of public policy conversations about financial inclusion and the unbanked and underbanked, but there is this kind of unspoken question about why African Americans are disproportionately within the population of unbanked and underbanked. I think it's about 14% to about 2% of white Americans are unbanked and underbanked. And that is I think of that as a huge gap. But I also think that there is this question of trust. This idea that perhaps white-owned financial institutions cannot be fully trusted with African Americans' money because of this generational legacy. And I've been saying this quite a bit as I've been talking about the book. I mean, members of my own family will oftentimes have money underneath the mattress or in a coffee can in some place in the house. The idea of having quick access to money and funds is really important. And so that comes from somewhere. That type of behavior does not just kind of come out of nowhere. And so really understanding the history of this bank, and understanding the fact too that as much as we talk about financial inclusion, we actually have to look at this period. 1865 was the first effort by the federal government to support financial inclusion through the creation of the Freedman's Bank. It was the most robust. And so again, I think this history is so important because I think it illuminates a lot of what we talk about today with the racial wealth gap and economic inequality along racial lines today.
Justine, thank you so much for being on the podcast. An amazing conversation. You are obviously a fount of knowledge and a wealth of knowledge that I'm thankful that I was able to receive the benefit of that. So thank you for what you did with the book. Thanks for being on the podcast. We appreciate it so much.
Yeah.
Thanks. This has been a lot of fun.
There you go. That was Greg and I with Justene Hill Edwards. Greg, I mentioned this in the introduction to the podcast, but we learned a lot in this episode, did we not?
We did. I learned tons of things. Let's see. I learned that I'm a better banker than anyone in the 1800s.
Yeah.
I learned that you can just volunteer for the job of actuary. I learned that banks are actually social welfare programs that also steal from the poor and the disenfranchised. I learned that no banker has ever gone to jail in the history of our country.
No.
I learned that someone with the title of trustee can be very untrustworthy. That's just a few. That's just a taste of the things I learned from today's discussion with Justene Hill Edwards. How about you, Caleb?
Oh my gosh. I have to say I've read about half of her book, and if you enjoyed this conversation, you will definitely enjoy the book because it goes into just greater detail about all of the things that happened. And then there's stuff, of course, that we didn't talk about at all. And for example, like one thing that sticks out in my mind is early on in the book, there is, I believe it is that Abraham Lincoln has been reelected, and they're at the inauguration of him being reelected, and Frederick Douglass is there, and Andrew Johnson is Abraham Lincoln's vice president, right? And he becomes president when after Abraham Lincoln is assassinated, and Frederick Douglass, and she kind of like, and this came, I think, from one of Frederick Douglass's autobiographies, but she excerpts it and she kind of describes the scene. But Frederick Douglass is at this inauguration, and he had met Lincoln, I think, a few times prior to this, but he had never met Andrew Johnson. and Lincoln like points out Frederick Douglass to Andrew Johnson, and Frederick Douglass sees him like pointing him out, and he said Johnson had the most awful look on his face when he saw Frederick Douglass, like just like a look of contempt for him.
No.
Oh yeah, no, it's crazy. And so then later on, after Johnson becomes president, Frederick Douglass and this kind of this group of black leaders go to the White House a few years later and to talk to him. I think it's after I don't remember which amendment but it was the amendment that gave black men the right to vote.
Okay.
I think it was maybe the 15th Amendment. I don't know. If Justine were here, she would tell us. Yeah. But anyway, so Frederick Douglass and these other black leaders are going to the White House, and they're encouraging Johnson to kind of like keep up the effort of Reconstruction, this and that and that. And Johnson has no interest in doing that. He was not for Reconstruction. But Douglass, in Justine's book, she talks about how Douglass he went into that meeting remembering his first encounter with Johnson and just how bad it was, and like Johnson even tried to unfake or like tried to undo his ugly face that he made or something.
Oh no.
And so he's like, oh, I just didn't scowl at you or anything. But it was clear that he's like, that guy's not my friend. He's not going to help. He's going to be a problem. It like, I don't know. It's just a great, I haven't finished it, but I'm enjoying the book immensely. And anyone who's, into history, especially from that period of time, I think will enjoy it very much. So that's my endorsement, I suppose, for Justine's book.
Well, and she, I mean, I didn't feel like it was any sort of like shameless self-promotion or anything, but when you asked Justine kind of about her, give us the story of how you got to writing about Freedman's Bank, she did talk about her other book, Unfree Markets, which I thought sounded fascinating, and I'm probably going to grab Unfree Markets because that sounds very, very interesting. The kind of the Venn diagram of capitalism and slavery in the United States. I think that sounds incredibly interesting.
Yep, absolutely. Justine's book, again, is Savings and Trust, The Rise and Betrayal of the Freedmen's Bank. Go out and get it wherever you get books. And you can find more about Justine at JustineHillEdwards.com. And we've included some additional links in the show notes, including to the book and some videos and some of her other writing. So yeah, check all that stuff out.
Okay, that's it for this episode. And remember, Andrew Johnson is no Abraham Lincoln.
And also remember, if you want to be an amateur history nerd, get into the Reconstruction era. We've got enough Civil War buffs. All right?
It's too many.
Too many.
Knock it off.
Too many. Yeah.
We get it. You're weird.
Weirdos.
Find something else to be interested in.
Yeah.
If you want to drop us a line, send us an email at ohmyfraud@earmarkcpe.com. Caleb, where can people find you out there on the internet?
Not on Twitter because I deleted my account finally, Greg. I am happy to report.
Oh.
They were threatening in the aftermath during the hurricanes. They were threatening meteorologists, and I cannot abide, Greg.
But so all those snarky tweets from 2013 are just gone now.
Gone. Because good riddance.
Yeah, good riddance. I was gonna say that's a loss, but you were like, I read a couple, not worth it.
Yeah, right. I am on LinkedIn though, Caleb Newquist.
I'm glad you asked. You can also find me on LinkedIn, Greg Kyte CPA.
Oh My Fraud is written by Greg Kyte and me, Caleb Newquist. Our producer is Zach Frank. Rate, review, and subscribe to the show wherever you listen to podcasts. You listen on Earmark, you can get free CPE, and the time is running out.
Oh yeah,
I believe it's early December when this episode is first released. So if you need CPE, better get it.
Yeah, man, I'll tell you what, it's a Earmark app. Get the subscriptions where you can binge all the episodes you can. It is the most painless way to get your CP. When you're driving across country for Christmas, just listen to every episode of Oh My Fraud and the Accounting Podcast and take the quiz when you get where you're going. And
2 times speed?
You'll rack them up. Yeah.
2 times speed?
I can't do 2 times. I can
It's
only
too
do
fast.
1.25.
Yeah, I think you're right.
But 1.25, sometimes when I'm listening at 1.25, I'm like going, how horribly slow are these people talking if this is what they sound like at 1.25 speed?
Yeah. The Zach's jazz selections don't quite sound as good at 1.25 though. Like the
Not
music
quite.
definitely has
Nope.
to be played at regular
Nope.
speed. But
Yeah.
nevertheless, yeah. There's more than 70 episodes. That's
Yeah.
a lot of CPE.
Yeah, a lot of it.
Okay. Join us next time for more avarice, swindlers, and scams from stories that will make you say, "Oh my!"
How are those people
fraud."
bankers? Oh, did I say the wrong? Oh.